all of this, and then I can go back and answer questions afterwards, if that's all right. Whose measurements should we use to demo? I'm going to use Catherine's measurements.
Okay. I'll get them in a second.
The cap was 1.5, not 0.5, right?
Say again?
The cap was 1.5.
Yeah.
Correct.
Okay, I'm gonna move my stuff out of your way.
Oh, you're not in my way.
Not your way.
I just need this much space.
You need that. That's it. Okay.
Okay. So, step one, you need to get yourself a piece of brown paper. You can see I just got a scrap out of the bin. P.S. Please remember, scraps that are this big, don't put them in the bin over there. Get rid of them. It started to turn into a little bit too much of a trash can. What's really important here is this length needs to be essentially your underarm to wrist plus your adjusted underarm to wrist plus your adjusted cap height plus a little bit. And this needs to be your adjusted bicep. You can see that what I've done once I got my scrap of paper is I actually folded the whole thing in half, long ways. First thing I'm going to do, I can see this is the length I've got to work with. In my eye, I'm going to roughly divide it into thirds. 1/3, 2/3. And I'm going to give myself a notch. It's completely arbitrary. I'm going to take my see-through ruler and I'm going to plot a line that is perpendicular to the folded edge of the fabric that runs through that notch. And I'm making sure that it's extra long. That one's about 12 inches. The first thing I'm going to do, Catherine, what was your adjusted underarm to wrist?
17 inches.
17. So from here, I'm going to measure to the right 17 inches and give myself another notch. And I'm going to draw a line again that's perpendicular to my folded edge that runs through that. I'm going to label this W for wrist. Actually, I guess I labeled it WR. I'm going to label this one BI for bicep. This was 17 inches. I'm going to divide that in half. I can do it one of two ways. I can either do math. What's half of 17 inches? 8.5. Or if I don't want to do math, I'm going to do the old-fashioned easy way. I'm going to fold and just match wrist to bicep and find midpoint and crease. And look, there's halfway. So if you don't want to do math, big deal, don't. And just as I did for the other two, plot a line that's perpendicular to the fold that runs through that notch. Guess what I'm going to label this one?
Elbow.
This one is elbow. E for elbow. Okay, bicep. Catherine, what was your adjusted bicep?
14.
14. Now I have to do math. Half of 14 is?
7.
7. So I'm going to measure along my bicep line from the fold over 7 inches and give myself a notch. What was your adjusted elbow, Catherine?
11.
11. What's half of 11? 5.5. Measure over along the elbow line 5.5 inches and give myself a notch. And last but not least, do you see a pattern here? What am I going to do next? What's half of my adjusted wrist?
What was your adjusted wrist?
My adjusted wrist was 6 1/4.
6 1/4. So what's half of that?
3
3
and
and 8.
3 1/8. Ordinarily, I'd ignore that 1/8, but for the wrist, it's important. Okay. Now, I'm going to use my straight edge and I'm going to connect the dots between my bicep notch and my wrist notch, and I'm going to draw in a line. But take a look. I'm drawing in the line very lightly. I'm not drawing it in dark at all. I'm going to draw in, because look at what that did to the elbow. It sort of cut all of that off, didn't it? That concerns me a little bit. The elbow needs some space. So the next thing I'm going to do is draw a second line that goes from bicep to elbow. And again, I'm drawing it in very lightly. Take a look down here. I have two lines that come to my wrist. Which one is correct? I'm not sure, so guess what I'm going to do?
Split the difference.
Split the difference, split the difference. I measure it, it's 7/8 of an inch, so 7/16. I find dead middle, again. You can just fold if you want. And then I draw in a line dark. A dark line that connects bicep to wrist. And that will be my final seam line. What is the name of this seam that will run down the inside of the arm?
Inseam.
It is the inseam. Much like pants and legs have an inseam and an outseam, sleeves and arms also have an inseam and an outseam. So that is my inseam. And now you can see that the lower portion of my sleeve is ready to go. Now comes the fun part, drafting the cap. Catherine, what was your adjusted cap height?
5.5.
5.5. So from bicep, I measure up 5.5 and I give myself a notch. Next thing I'm going to do is fold. Along the bicep line, I'm going to match this folded edge, which represents the outseam, to the notch that represents the inseam, and I'm going to give myself a little crease, so that crease is right there on the line. I could have measured if I wanted to. It's still halfway. You can do it either mathematically or by folding. It doesn't matter. Now comes the tricky part. I'm going to use my see-through ruler, and I'm going to draw a line that is perpendicular to the bicep line that runs through that notch right there. Just like so. Excuse me. Catherine's adjusted cap height was 5.5. We have to do some math now again. What's half of 5.5?
2 3/4.
2 3/4. I'm going to measure up this new line that I just drew, 2 3/4, and give myself a notch. Okay. Let's go back to this point right here where the bicep line and the inseam intersect. I'm going to measure backwards towards my outseam 1/4 inch and give myself a notch. So I just added in that one right there. One thing I want you to notice, when I drew in this notch right here, I actually did it long. And that's important for this next step.
What's the 1/4 inch that you added at the bicep?
Hold for 1 minute.
Okay.
It doesn't have a name.
Okay.
Along this notch, I'm also going to measure over 1/4 inch and give myself another notch. Now, I'm going to connect the dots between this. Oh, look, it actually is a straight line. That almost never happens. You would connect the dots between that and that and that and that. A lot of times they are not a straight line. This time they are, which is a little strange.
You said a square.
So now the last thing I'm going to do, what you start to see here is that this is the upper portion of the sleeve. If you can visualize that this is the outseam, that's right there, right? So this section from here to here is the upper portion of the sleeve that goes from what we're going to call the shoulder notch to the balance point right there. And then this is what happens underneath. The thing that's interesting here is to be able to create that out of fabric, what we have to do is create an S curve. And so our curve is going to look something like this. The reason that we added this 1/4 inch here and this 1/4 inch here was to get a smooth transition back into a 90-degree angle right there, and a smooth transition back into our inseam right there. I want you to notice something as I draw these curves, because I'm just freehanding at the moment, right? I'm not giving you any sort of formula to pay attention to. I will tell you, based upon what I see, I want you to take a look at this right here, because I've created a little shape right there and right there. Notice they look very similar to one another, don't they? It's like this is the outside portion of the curve, and then the exact same shape is created right there, but on the inside as the S reverses on itself, right? Mm-hmm. I actually prefer the way that this one looks. And this is just an arbitrary choice. There's not anything scientific about it. So I'm going to go true it up. I can see on my curve that it looks like this is a good match for it right there. So I'm going to trace it in. But at the same time, I'm also going to note, I'm starting at my 1 1/4 calibration there, and I'm ending at 5 5/8 there. So then I can turn over and reverse it. 1 1/4 to 5 5/8 right there.
They have to be the same calibrations.
It's true. And so now actually the negative space that we've created here
Turns into positive
is
over there.
equal to the positive space right there. Why did I do all of this with the paper folded in half? Because the arm is symmetrical, isn't it? So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my paper scissors and I'm going to carefully cut out along my wrist, along my inseam, along my arm's eye edge. It does feel like it just ran out of paper on the backside.
Oh, no.
If I needed to, I would go in and tape some. But for the purposes of our conversation, it will be fine. Yeah, it feels like I'm missing just a little tiny corner. I'm going to use my pounce wheel, and I'm going to pounce my elbow line right there, and I'm going to pounce my balance point right there before I unfold. So now I can see my elbow line and my balance point right there. In terms of generating the pattern, there's one last thing we need to do. Feel your arm again. If you feel here, you have less flesh at this balance point than you do here, right? As a result, a completely symmetrical sleeve cap doesn't work for us. We need some excess here and a little bit less right here. So we're going to choose one of the two of these. It doesn't matter which one. I'm going to call it this one. And I'm going to call this the front of the sleeve, and that's the back of the sleeve. I take on the front side, I'm going to find the point that is halfway between my inseam and my balance point. And you can see I just folded, and so I have a little crease there, and I'm adding in a notch. At that notch, I measure backwards into the sleeve 1/4 of an inch. And now I use my curve. And as you've noticed, the way that I like to deal with my curves is I tend to sketch them in first so that I can actually kind of see what I think it wants to be first. And then I use my curve to true it up. And chop it away. So I now have an asymmetrical sleeve. I have a sleeve that shows that is shaped for the front and the back. The very last step I'm going to do, much like you've done for all of your other projects, is I'm going to notch. in order for this to be complete, you need a set of elbow notches, you need a shoulder notch, and we need balance point notches as well as something to show front and back. So elbow, just a notch there, and its friend. Shoulder notch, just right here where the center line crosses the armhole. Balance point notch there. Balance point notch there. The last thing I need is I need a set of notches to be able to show which is the front of the sleeve and which is the back of the sleeve. Again, if I'm going to send this off to somebody else, they need to be able to understand that. The way that we indicate that is we put a single notch right there. On the back side, we put a double notch. The more notches it is on any piece of pattern, on any pattern piece, the further towards the back it is. You know, so if we had a skirt that had 4 pieces in it, center back would probably have a quadruple notch right on it.
Does it matter where it is?
You know, I'm just putting it someplace in between that point, in between the balance point and the inseam. It doesn't matter where otherwise. The last thing we need to do before the pattern is complete is, there's one super important piece of information that's missing. What is it?
Grain line.
We have to mark our grain line. Where's our grain line going to go on this?
Long ways.
Dead down the center. Straight on that fold. And so the truth is, I just need to do this and that, and now I've got a grain line marked as well. You are going to cut and assemble a single sleeve for class on Wednesday. When you go to cut and assemble, you will use standard sleeve measurements. The hem always gets 2 inches.
Oh, seam allowance.
Seam allowance.
That's what you're talking about.
The inseam always gets 1 inch. The armhole, much like the armhole in your garment, always gets 1 1/4 inch seam allowance. Just like this sloper, when you go to assemble, where are you going to stay stitch? And where are you not going to stay stitch?
Stitch the curves, so around the arm holes.
Around the armhole, there's one other place you're going to stay stitch. Wrist. You know, the thing is, if you think about it, I'm not sure if you guys discussed it when Brenda was talking about this. Anything that's not getting sewn to something else gets stay stitched.
Wait, the armhole doesn't get sewn to something?
This is not getting sewn to anything for the
Oh,
moment.
well, I guess, yeah,
So it's
for-
a single unit, so it doesn't, so it will get stay stitched.
Do you feel? Oh, it's 1 1/4. Yeah.
1 1/4 all along here. Mary, it's past 10.
I know.
I'm curious about this cutting away on the front part because we cut something away but didn't add it anywhere else.
It's true. Why not?
Oh, is that the part about there being more flesh in the back than in
Exactly.
the front?
And so we're not putting it anyplace else because we don't need it anyplace else. Really, all we're doing is just eliminating it from that spot because it's too much to begin
The
with.
adjusted measurement that lets us do that then?
You are correct. In theory,
And that's where we're going to discover.
you are correct. So at the beginning of class on Wednesday, you should be able to put this on your arm.
What if I can't get my hand?
Mary's already starting class discussion for Wednesday. Because you won't be able to get it all the way on your arm, but not just because of that.
No.
Dun dun dun! Spoiler alert! It's like scenes from next episode.
Just because I did all those